welcome back to another episode here on Swish City. I'm your host, Bruce Veliz, and in today's episode, we're going to be doing another one of our NBA season previews and offseason breakdowns as we dive into every single team ahead of the NBA 25-26 start season to go over my predictions for them. And today's episode, we're going to be diving in and exploring the Portland Trail Blazers, as you guys can tell by the title and the thumbnail. So if you do enjoy the content, let me know your thoughts down below in the comment section. Hit that subscribe button, and if your team has not been mentioned, let me know so I can see if your team is going to be coming up soon, because like I mentioned, we're going to be diving into every single team before the start of the year. Without further ado, let's dive in and let's explore this Portland Trail Blazers team. So the Portland Trail Blazers are a little confusing for me. I ultimately am very excited for their season this year and excited to see what really transforms from their young group, really going to lead this, as we saw in the month of March last season that the Blazers got on a really, really good hot streak and looked like they could potentially even make the play-in towards the end of last year. But with them making some little weird moves and then bringing in a very, very unfamiliar face, but with him looking pretty solid so far in the Summer League, there are a lot of questions on how great this Blazers team can truly be. And from looking at their additions, subtractions, and stuff like that, it does look like, very similarly to a team like the Washington Wizards, they are building with this young core and giving them their, full utmost ability to grow in the starting lineup, but adding veterans as well, guys who can kind of come in, be those leaders in the locker room, but also help mold these kind of guys into better young stars and what they truly can be, because none of these players really for the Blazers here were number one, number two picks, guys that were set to have that high standard, really, besides Scoot Henderson, who's had a little bit of a slower start to his career with dealing with some injuries, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But without further ado, let's dive in and let's break down the Blazers, looking at who they added first onto this roster. So looking at who the Blazers added, we can see that they made one trade this offseason, and it is the one trade that we all very, very know with the Blazers here, as they traded for Jrue Holiday and traded away Anthony Simons. Now, for the Blazers, we'll go over the addition side first, talk about the Simons piece really next, but Holiday, I think, is a good addition for this Blazers team. Is he perfect? Is he the number one guy that they should be adding? No, but I do think he was a lot better of a fit than Anthony Simons, as for this point guard room with him and Scoot Henderson, they were kind of really competing to be that starting point guard, and then with Shaedon Sharpe being in that rotation, it was kind of competing to be those top three, and then Sharpe maybe playing some small forward, being a little undersized, but then you got the two wings, Kamara and Avdija. Wasn't really fitting their long-term plans with all these young players, and Simons was their young player that they believed in post Damian Lillard, who was supposed to take that leap when Dame really got hurt, but necessarily didn't really live to those expectations. He's still a great player across the league, someone who can still average some great points, be a three-point shooter, sniper, playmaker, someone that's going to be very valuable on that offensive end, but ultimately, I don't necessarily know as, a number two, number three option realistically, and for the Blazers, they need to figure that out. So moving off of him was key. I did have a big contract, and they bring in Jrue Holiday, who does have a bigger contract than Anthony Simons, but a team that can hold on to the salary and can use a guy in Jrue Holiday to be this great mentor for these younger players, like I just mentioned, and Shaedon Sharpe and Scoot Henderson, to teach them about the maturity, teach them about being a veteran leader, and for someone in Scoot Henderson who's had seen some struggles in some playmaking areas, having a guy like Jrue Holiday to come in who is notoriously been known to be an off-ball player starting earlier on, but also as an on-ball creator going on with the Bucks and the Boston Celtics. He can be someone that can help out the offense with the ball in his hands or without, and I think that's going to be something great for Henderson to learn. Also, just learning his defensive qualities and traits, something that the Blazers really lacked in this guard room, is something that's going to be very vital for their additions. We're bringing in Jrue Holiday. Even if he's a little bit older, it could present themselves to still be a tradable contract down the line and something that they could flip to get even a better piece into the building that really helps their direction as well. They also brought in Damian Lillard, which was a huge shocker after obviously Lillard had been waived by the Milwaukee Bucks, which was a big story of the off season. But Lillard is brought back to the Blazers, where he never originally wanted to leave, in a place where he wanted to finish his career. Now, obviously, he tore his Achilles at the end of last year, so he is going to be out for presumably this entire season. And even with guys like Halliburton and Jason Tatum having their speedy recoveries, with Lillard being a little bit older, it makes sense for him to sit out this entire season and just be someone to kind of oversee this Blazers team, to be back in the locker room, and once again, to be another veteran leader, someone to help out this team, and someone to be another voice for this squad. Obviously, him in the front office kind of repatched their issues from before he was traded, and now it looks like Lillard is going to be someone for the latter half of his career, going to be a key role player and helping the Blazers kind of get into that next step, and then hopefully maybe winning a championship with this Blazers team as well. They also added Blake Wesley, who comes over from the Washington Wizards. He was was traded from the Washington Wizards, or from the Spurs to the Washington Wizards in the Kelly Olynyk deal, and then was waived by the Wizards once they were over the roster limit. He then goes over to Portland to now try to find himself as a scorer within this unit as a backup shooting guard. They also, in the draft, only made one selection, and this selection was Yang Hansen Yang, who was the guy from China. No one knew, me personally, did not know much about him going into the draft, and ultimately was the shock of the draft when he was selected right outside of the lottery at pick 16, when the Blazers, who had pick 11, decided to trade back with the Grizzlies for Cedric Coward, someone who was due to be one of the draft risers. They trade him for a guy that was projected to go in the second round. A lot of heads were turning with this Blazers pick, but he has looked solid throughout the summer league and could be their new face into that center room, who could be this changing pick like guys in the past like Nikola Jokic and Giannis Antetokounmpo. Now, I'm obviously not going to give him that title right away, but it's something that could be possible. And then looking at the two-way players for this Blazers team, they have two, Caleb Love and Sidy Cissoko, which means that the Blazers still can add one more player to a two-way spot, meaning that one of these guys that are on an Exhibit 10 contract that are not pictured here in this diagram could be brought back on to this Blazers team as a two-way, or we could see the Blazers throughout the season look to add a young player that does get waived or bought out to their two-way slot. But Love obviously had some success in college, playing over at UNC and Arizona the past couple of years. Obviously an older guard looking to make his way into the NBA. And then Sidy Cissoko, drafted from France, had played with the San Antonio Spurs for a couple years, ultimately got waived, then was brought into Portland, is now on a two-way deal after being on a guaranteed contract last year, looking to find himself back to that spot. Now, let's discuss who the Blazers ultimately lost this offseason as well. So the Blazers ultimately lost Anthony Simons as they traded him for Drew Holiday, and like I mentioned earlier, with Drew Holiday, I think that this makes some sense. Simons was really not fitting into this young core anymore, being a little bit older than them, and was kind of conflicting with either starting him and trying to win games, or starting the younger guys and trying to figure out who could blossom into a young rising star. And personally, I have very, very high hopes for Shaedon Sharpe, and I am very happy for Anthony Simons to be traded, because I feel like this was hindering his development within that group alongside Scoot Henderson. No offense to Simons, I still think he could be a valuable, player across the league. I know he's very comparable to a guy in Malik Monk, who's, very offensive, kind of six-man-y type scorer build. And that's where it gets a little confusing, because for Simons, he makes $25 million, which in the new CBA is not reflective of that six-man role. So it makes his contract a little bit weird and tradable. I know for the Celtics, they wanted to move off the Drew Holiday contract, so getting any pay cut, even if it does conflict in their starting lineup, makes sense. And for Simons, that does that. And for the Blazers, I think this was a win-win trade on both ends. When looking at who left in free agency, we can look and discuss three players that left. Bryce McGowens and Jabari Walker, two former two-way players on this roster, are now going to be moving on and looking to find spots elsewhere across the league. Bryce McGowens in New Orleans, Jabari Walker over in Philadelphia, in which the other big move for the Blazers, and one that shook a lot of heads similar to the Damian Lillard wave, was another big waiving, and that was DeAndre Ayton, as he was waived by the Blazers, not even given the full amount of his contract, and he goes and signs with the Los Angeles Lakers, taking on the remaining amount of money in a one-year deal. Ayton was brought into the Blazers, of course, with the Damian Lillard trade. He was the main focal point in that move, which was a big one that shocked every basically team involved, taking the Suns basically away with no center, leaving them helpless in that point, giving the Bucks an opportunity to try and win a championship with injuries, making that not possible, and then giving the Blazers DeAndre Ayton, arguably one of the worst pieces in that deal, as he never blossomed over in the Blazers area. There were times where he didn't show up to the arena because he was snowed out. It seemingly seemed like DeAndre Ayton, just once he got that big contract, was just very lazy and didn't really care to be in Portland at that moment, and was just kind of there just collecting a check in my eyes. Ayton, as we know, dealt with some injuries, had some nice rising points for the Blazers where he actually looked like he could be back to dominating, but then once again on the defensive end, just seemingly lacks and struggles. And we can see with the Lakers already so far in the preseason that it might not be the best fit over there either. Unfortunately, for the number 1 overall pick, this is just a tough bid. And for the Blazers, ultimately, they do lose that Damian Lillard trade, but they get Damian Lillard back. They get all those picks. They find a way to kind of work around this, but still losing DeAndre. And then it's kind of funny that they traded Damian Lillard for DeAndre and then they ultimately have to waive DeAndre in to bring back Damian Lillard. Just how the storybook ending goes. And then lastly, when looking at this roster, there are 2 players that were on this team that remain unsigned. Justin Minaya, who was competing for a two-way spot with this team, has not been brought back, in Delano Banton. Now, Delano Banton was someone that had been on the Boston Celtics, was traded to the Blazers the year previous, and had a pretty solid second half with the Blazers, in which resembled him to be still on this roster. Unfortunately for Banton, the 6'8 guard just doesn't really have the best offensive skill set, and in a team of the Blazers where they have to kind of give some of these other guys young play, like Scoot Henderson, Shaedon Sharpe, he just doesn't really fit in. Unfortunately, the offensive game not really translating from Banton really has limited his abilities to be successful here for the Blazers and in the NBA, which has now resulted in him in being a free agent at this moment, not being signed. So now, let's dive into the depth chart and let's talk about this Blazers team. So the Blazers are at the 15th roster limit, which means they cannot bring anyone into this roster, which means that at this moment, this is what it's looking like. Scoot Henderson, Shaedon Sharpe, Toumani Camara, Denny Avdija, Donovan Clingan would be my projected starting 5. Now, as we all know, Scoot Henderson is going to be starting the season with an injury, which means he is not going to be starting. Jrue Holiday is most likely going to be starting there, but I would say that Jrue most likely does come off the bench for this Blazers team just because Scoot is the former number 3 overall pick. With Anthony Simons no longer here, this is the one and only opportunity to allow Scoot to be that full-on point guard and to see what you have out of him. Was this pick a bust? Is he just a late bloomer? Does he need specific circumstances or instances for him to be successful with this team? That is what you're going to find out with running this. We're going to have to wait a couple weeks or months because Scoot is injured, unfortunately, but this is something that I see the Blazers wanting to do. Shaedon Sharpe, I think, is going to try and take over to be that number 1 scoring option. Obviously, he has been hindered with injuries these last couple of seasons as well, but also with Anthony Simons, Scoot, all these other guards in the rotation, Shaedon has been able to excel to try to find that. And for the Blazers this year, I think finding out who that number 1 option is going to be key. Toumani Camara, Denny Avdija, 2 of the better wings and defensive wings in this league, but now on this team in Portland, seemingly fit like a glove and complement these other scorers. Ultimately, I do think the Blazers do need some more outside scoring and shooting. They very do lack that in the starting lineup. Even with Scoot Henderson, Shaedon Sharpe, Toumani Camara, Denny Avdija, and Donovan Clingan, none of these guys are exceptional three-point scorers. They all can shoot the 3-ball. But it would be nice to have a guy like an Anthony Simons or something like that, but, maybe not $25 million and maybe not as that prolific name as Anthony Simons within this rotation help out that scoring. But that's where you have guys like Blake Wesley, Ryan Rupert in that shooting guard room who hopefully can be pretty solid for them. Alongside that, like we mentioned, Jrue Holiday is in this point guard room. He's most likely going to be starting, but when Scoot comes back, can be that, once again, secondary playmaker, someone who can help initiate offenses, something he did in Boston, but also be that defensive anchor for that secondary unit because this first unit has very good defenders, but the second unit doesn't have as much. So having Jrue Holiday there, I think, will be key. We also talk about, like I mentioned, Toumani Camara, Denny Avdija, some great wings in this rotation. I think they're going to be even better. Avdija coming over from Washington really fit like a glove within this team, and I think is going to be someone solid. Toumani Camara, another young piece that the Blazers got from the Suns, and we're very lucky to get from the Suns as he's one of the better two-way wings across in the league. I think is going to continue to develop that this year. Matisse Thybulle, on a tradable contract for the Blazers. Maybe can be a bootleg of Toumani Camara for them, hopefully, as just another defender, but he could be someone potentially traded. Jeremy Grant is probably the most questionable name in this rotation, as he still makes around $38 to $40 million. Clearly not worth that money, and obviously is not worth that money in the NBA, in my opinion, as he unfortunately has just slowed down a little bit. And when he was very successful as a number one option, it was on teams where it was very clearly he was the number one option and the best player on that squad. I do think that Grant can still be, a viable third or fourth option for a championship or playoff level team, even at this point of his career with him slowing down. But with that $40 million contract, it's very resemblant to a contract in Zach LaVine, where it's just not really tradable, and you're just going to have to find a team that's willing to do a flip for that contract. And maybe the Blazers can find that down the line, but at this moment, it doesn't look like they're going to find that with Jeremy Grant. Chris Murray, obviously another young piece, his brother being Keegan Murray over on the Sacramento Kings. I'd like to see him get some more run, as once again, he could be one of those valuable shooters on the wing if he can get that burn time as that backup power forward, and I think deservedly should if this team does move off of Jeremy Grant. And then we get to the crowded center room over in Portland. That was crowded once again last year. 4 centers last year, basically replacing Hanson Yang with DeAndre Ayton. I think that's solid because they're getting younger. They're drafting in a guy that has some untapped potential that clearly was going to be better than DeAndre Ayton, but they drafted Donovan Clingan the year previous. Now Clingan, coming out of UConn, pretty solid defender, but does have some weaknesses, so maybe Hanson Yang can't overlap those. Maybe we get to see some Donovan Clingan power forward with playing against some Hanson Yang. Robert Williams III, obviously another tradable contract that the Blazers got in the Drew Holiday deal 2 summers ago, Now Robert Williams is obviously with Drew Holiday on the Blazers. His injuries have obviously caused him to still not be traded from this Blazers team, but with him being on an expiring $13 million contract, and with the Blazers having 4 centers, if Clingan and Yang look solid, I would not be shocked if Robert Williams is moved for a salary dump or anything, with teams still desperately needing center across the league if he is healthy, because he's a solid lob threat, solid rim protector when he is healthy. And then Duop Reath, one of my favorite budget value centers across the league, had a really solid year 2 years ago. Last year struggled a little bit more on the offensive end and rebounding end, but with the Blazers, ultimately, I just think doesn't really fit. He's just kind of an injury insurance kind of fodder player for this Blazers team, but I think on some other teams across the league that desperately could use that rebounding, he could be a solid tertiary center in their rotations. So I would not be shocked also again if he is moved, but also if the Blazers do like Donovan Clingan and Hanson Yang and want to run both of those guys or potentially even run them together, then using Duop Reath and maybe moving off of Robert Williams could be still effective for this Blazers squad. So with that being said, looking at the Blazers depth chart, I'm very high on Shaedon Sharpe, Toumani Camara, Denny Avila. I'm very intrigued to see what Damian Lillard can do next season, what Drew Holiday can bring within this team, and how guys like Jeremy Grant and Matisse Thybulle find themselves into this rotation throughout the year. With that all being said, I do have the Blazers coming in at 12th here on my predictions in the Western Conference. I do have them over the previous 3 teams that we've talked about in the West, in the Jazz, Pelicans, and Kings. And I did have them kind of in a toss-up with the other 2 teams that are ahead of them in the Western Conference. But ultimately, when I looked at those other 2 teams compared to the Blazers, I saw names. And I saw guys that even with injuries, even with some weird changes that have gone on with those rosters, I think ultimately those teams can work better together because they have some star power already on there. Unfortunately for the Portland Trail Blazers, they don't, right? They are trying to identify their star. And yes, Shaedon Sharpe could easily take that leap. Camara could take that leap. Clingan could take that leap. Hanson Yang or Young Hanson could take that leap. Scoot Henderson, when he comes back from injury, could. All these possibilities are there, and I do think that the Blazers are going to finish better than 12th ultimately. But when I look at this roster compared to other teams, even though those teams might have some injuries or might have some weird changes that went on this offseason that might think that they might be lower, ultimately, I do think the Blazers, because they are so young and they're still trying to find stuff out still in this tough Western Conference, that they're going to be slated here just a little worse than those 2 teams. But ultimately, I would not be shocked. The team that I have in 11th, I was ultimately changing, and right before I recorded this video, I ultimately made it the Blazers, but it truly was a 50-50. So tune into tomorrow's video to check out what that team is. Let me know your thoughts if they could maybe be better than the Blazers or worse. And Ultimately, we'll have to see this season what ultimately does happen. Last year, my predictions weren't 100% correct, and I'm not expecting them to be this time either. But I do think that the Blazers will be a fun, exciting team, and one of them, I will say, one of my League Pass teams, 100%. Thank you guys so much for tuning into today's episode here. We broke down the Blazers. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comment section if you enjoyed the video. Once again, make sure to hit that like, subscribe button. Stay tuned for your team coming up here on these series. But I really do appreciate all the love and support in these videos. It truly does mean a lot. But I'll catch you guys in the next one. Have a great rest of your day, and peace out.